The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand entrance of Buckingham Palace, as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his iconic red uniform and tall black hat. At 42 years old, he had served as a Queen's Guard for nearly 2 decades, standing motionless for hours while tourists snapped photos and tried desperately to make him smile or react. The rules were crystal clear. No talking, no moving, no acknowledgement of the crowds that gathered daily around the palace gates. Thomas had always prided himself on being the perfect soldier. His posture was impeccable, his uniform spotless, and his discipline unwavering. Fellow guards respected him, officers praised his dedication, and tourists often left disappointed by his stone-like demeanor. He believed that maintaining the dignity and tradition of the Royal Guard was more important than anything else. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, the usual crowd of tourists began gathering early. School groups from various countries pointed excitedly at the guards, elderly couples posed for photos, and street performers tried to entertain the waiting crowds. Thomas took his position at the main gate, his rifle held precisely at his side, his eyes fixed straight ahead at an invisible point in the distance. The day started normally enough. A group of Japanese tourists bowed respectfully before taking pictures. A young couple from Australia tried making funny faces to get a reaction, giving up after several minutes. Children ran around their parents' legs, some brave enough to wave at the imposing figure in red, others hiding behind their mothers' skirts at the sight of the tall, stern-looking guard. As the morning progressed, Thomas noticed a small commotion near the palace railings. A woman in her 30s was kneeling beside a wheelchair, speaking softly to an elderly man who appeared to be her father. The man looked frail and thin, his hands shaking slightly as they rested on a blanket covering his legs. His daughter was pointing toward the guards, explaining something that Thomas couldn't hear from his position. The woman approached one of Thomas's colleagues stationed nearby, speaking quietly and gesturing toward her father. The guard maintained his rigid stance, offering no response or acknowledgement. She tried again with another guard, receiving the same silent treatment. Thomas watched from the corner of his eye as disappointment crossed her face. Eventually, the woman began wheeling her father closer to where Thomas stood. As they approached, he could hear fragments of their conversation. The elderly man was speaking in a weak voice about his time serving in the Royal Navy during World War II, how he had always dreamed of meeting one of the Queen's Guards, and how this visit to London might be his last chance. The daughter positioned the wheelchair directly in front of Thomas's post. The old veteran looked up with cloudy but hopeful eyes, his military medals pinned to his jacket catching the morning light. His daughter whispered something about her father's service record and his admiration for the Royal Guard's tradition and discipline. Thomas felt something stirring inside him that he had never experienced during his years of service. Here was a man who had served his country with honor, who had faced dangers that Thomas could only imagine, and whose only wish was for a moment of acknowledgement from a fellow serviceman. The strict regulations echoed in Thomas's mind, reminding him of his duty to remain motionless and silent. The elderly veteran reached into his jacket pocket with trembling hands and pulled out a faded photograph. He held it up toward Thomas, though his weak arms could barely lift it high enough. In the photo, a young sailor in Royal Navy uniform stood proudly on the deck of a warship, his face filled with the same pride and determination that Thomas recognized in himself. As minutes passed, Thomas found himself in an impossible situation. Every fiber of his training told him to ignore the scene unfolding before him, to maintain his professional composure regardless of circumstances. Yet something deeper, more human, was calling him to break the rules that had defined his career. The old man's hopeful expression, his daughter's gentle encouragement, and the weight of shared military service created a moment that demanded more than rigid adherence to protocol. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing something significant was happening. Other tourists stopped their chatter and phone conversations, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something special. Even the street performers paused their acts, creating an unusual bubble of silence around the wheelchair-bound veteran and the motionless guard. Thomas could feel the eyes of his fellow guards upon him, knowing that whatever decision he made in the next few moments would be observed and remembered. His superiors had always emphasized that the Queen's Guard represented something larger than individual soldiers. that their unwavering discipline was a symbol of British military tradition and royal dignity. Yet, as he looked down at the frail, veteran, Thomas realized that true honor might sometimes require breaking the very rules designed to preserve it. Time seemed to slow as Thomas Mitchell weighed his decision. The elderly veteran's eyes remained fixed on him with a mixture of hope and understanding, as if the old sailor knew the internal battle being fought behind the guard's stoic expression. The photograph in his weathered hands trembled slightly, and Thomas could make out more details of the young naval officer who had served his country over 70 years ago. Without moving his head or changing his rigid posture, Thomas allowed his eyes to shift downward, making direct eye contact with the wheelchair-bound veteran for the first time. In that brief moment of connection, he saw recognition flash across the old man's face. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the watching crowd, but unmistakably real. Then, in a movement so slight that most observers would miss it entirely, Thomas offered the smallest of nods. It lasted perhaps half a second, barely disturbing the perfect lines of his uniform, but it carried the weight of respect from one serviceman to another. The veteran's eyes immediately filled with tears, and his daughter placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, understanding that something profound had just occurred. The old sailor slowly brought his hand to his forehead in a shaky but dignified salute, holding it there for several seconds before lowering it to his lap. His daughter wheeled him back a few feet, but he continued to watch Thomas with newfound joy radiating from his weathered features. Other tourists began to notice the emotional exchange, though few understood exactly what had transpired. Word of the brief interaction spread quickly among the crowd. Whispers in multiple languages rippled through the gathered tourists as people shared what they thought they had witnessed. Some claimed the guard had winked, others insisted he had smiled. But the veteran and his daughter knew the truth was far more meaningful than casual observers could understand. As the day continued, Thomas found himself changed by the encounter. His posture remained perfect, his discipline intact, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. The rigid adherence to rules that had once defined his service now seemed less important than the human connections that gave those rules meaning in the first place. Later that afternoon, another situation arose that would test his newfound perspective. A group of schoolchildren from a local primary school had arrived for an educational tour. Among them was a young girl, perhaps 7 years old, who walked with crutches due to a birth defect that affected her legs. While her classmates ran excitedly around the palace grounds, she struggled to keep up, her face showing determination despite her obvious fatigue. The little girl approached Thomas's position with careful, measured steps. Her teacher tried to call her back, explaining that the guards couldn't be disturbed. But the child was determined to get closer. She positioned herself directly in front of him, looking up with wide, curious eyes that held no fear or expectation, only genuine interest in the impressive figure before her. From her small backpack, she pulled out a drawing she had made in art class. The crayon artwork depicted a red-uniformed guard standing proudly in front of a castle with the words, "Thank you for keeping us safe," written in a child's careful handwriting across the bottom. She held up the picture, not seeking a response, but simply wanting to share her appreciation. Thomas felt his resolve wavering again. The morning's encounter with the veteran had already challenged his strict interpretation of duty, and now this innocent gesture from a child who had worked hard just to reach his post struck him even more deeply. He thought about his own daughter, who was about the same age as this little girl, and how proud she would be if someone showed such kindness to him. The child waited patiently, her drawing extended toward him like an offering. Her classmates had gathered nearby, watching to see what would happen. The teacher approached apologetically, preparing to guide the girl away. But something in Thomas's demeanor made her pause, breaking protocol for the second time that day. Thomas allowed himself to look down at the drawing. His eyes moved slowly across the colorful artwork, taking in every detail of the child's careful work. Then, maintaining his rigid posture but allowing the smallest hint of warmth to enter his expression, he gave another almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The little girl's face lit up with pure joy. She carefully placed the drawing at the base of his post, where it wouldn't interfere with his duties but would remain visible as a reminder of her visit. As her teacher gently guided her back to the group, she turned to wave goodbye, her face glowing with happiness at having successfully delivered her gift. Other guards had witnessed both interactions, and Thomas could sense their curiosity about his behavior. Some looked disapproving, wondering if he was compromising the dignity of their position. Others seemed thoughtful, perhaps reconsidering their own strict adherence to regulations in light of what they had observed. As evening approached and the tourist crowds began to thin, Thomas reflected on the day's events. 2 small acts of compassion had cost him nothing in terms of his professional duties, yet they had created moments of genuine human connection that would be remembered long. After his shift ended, the veteran would carry the memory of respect received from a fellow serviceman, and the little girl would remember the day a palace guard acknowledged her artwork. These interactions had planted a seed that would grow into something much larger, changing not only Thomas's approach to his duties but eventually influencing his fellow guards and the entire culture of service at the palace. The transformation had begun with simple human recognition, proving that sometimes the most powerful acts of compassion require nothing more than seeing others as worthy of acknowledgement and respect. Word of Thomas Mitchell's subtle acts of compassion spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within days, social media posts featuring blurry photos and eyewitness accounts of the guards' interactions began circulating online. The veteran's daughter had shared their story on a military family support page, describing how a simple nod from a Queen's Guard had brought her father more joy than any medal ceremony or official recognition ever had. The story reached beyond typical tourist tales, touching something deeper in people's hearts. Veterans organizations shared the post, praising the Guard's recognition of a fellow serviceman's sacrifice. Parents commented about their own children's drawings being acknowledged by authority figures and the importance of such small gestures in building young people's confidence. However, not all the attention was positive. Military traditionalists criticized what they saw as a breakdown in discipline and protocol. Letters to newspapers questioned whether guards were becoming too casual in their duties. Some retired officers wrote stern opinions about maintaining the dignity and separation that made the Queen's Guard a respected institution. Thomas found himself called into his commanding officer's office 3 days after the incidents. Colonel James Hartwell, a career military man in his 50s, sat behind his desk with a stack of newspaper clippings and printed social media posts spread before him. His expression was unreadable as Thomas stood at attention, waiting for what he expected to be a severe reprimand. "Sergeant Mitchell," the colonel began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "it seems you've become something of a celebrity. Care to explain these reports about your conduct while on duty?" Thomas maintained his military bearing as he replied, "Sir, I maintained my post and fulfilled my duties according to regulations. Any interactions were minimal and did not compromise the dignity of the Guard." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then picked up one of the printed articles. This veteran's daughter writes that her father, a Royal Navy veteran of World War II, received what she calls the most meaningful acknowledgement of his service in decades. She says he's been telling everyone who will listen about the Guard who showed him proper military respect. Thomas remained silent, unsure whether he was being praised or criticized. Colonel Hartwell continued, "And this teacher writes that one of her students, a disabled child who struggles with confidence, has been drawing pictures of guards ever since her visit. Apparently, she tells everyone that a real palace guard liked her artwork enough to look at it carefully." The office fell quiet, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Finally, the colonel set down the papers and looked directly at Thomas. "In 30 years of military service, I've seen soldiers follow orders without question, maintain discipline under pressure, and uphold traditions with unwavering commitment. These are all admirable qualities that form the backbone of our service." Thomas braced himself for the criticism he was certain would follow. Instead, the colonel's expression softened slightly. "But I've also learned that true leadership sometimes means knowing when humanity should take precedence over regulations. What you did took more courage than standing motionless for hours. You risked your reputation and career to acknowledge the dignity of people who deserved recognition." The unexpected turn left Thomas momentarily speechless. The colonel stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace grounds, where tourists were already gathering for the day. The Queen's Guard exists to serve the crown and the people of Britain, he continued. Sometimes we forget that the people includes the individual faces in the crowd, not just an abstract concept of citizenship. Your actions reminded everyone that our service has a human purpose. Colonel Hartwell turned back to face Thomas. However, we cannot have guards making individual decisions about when to break protocol. That would lead to chaos and inconsistency, so I'm implementing a new directive, effective immediately. Thomas felt his stomach tighten, expecting severe restrictions on any future interactions. From now on, the colonel announced, all guards are authorized to acknowledge veterans displaying military decorations with a respectful nod, and to briefly acknowledge children's respectful gifts or drawings. These acknowledgments must be subtle, dignified, and brief. Any guard who abuses this privilege will face immediate disciplinary action. The announcement transformed what had been individual acts of compassion into official policy. Thomas realized that his small gestures had not only avoided punishment, but had actually changed the rules for all Queen's Guards. Furthermore, the colonel continued, we're establishing a monthly ceremony where particularly meaningful interactions between guards and the public will be recognized. The veteran you acknowledged has been invited to attend next month's ceremony, along with the young girl who drew the picture. As Thomas left the colonel's office, he felt a mixture of relief and responsibility. His actions had opened a door that could never be fully closed again. The rigid interpretation of duty that had once defined the Queen's Guard was evolving to include compassionate service alongside traditional discipline. That afternoon, as he took his position at the palace gates, Thomas noticed a difference in the crowd's behavior. People approached more respectfully. Parents guided their children with greater awareness of the guard's dual role as both ceremonial figures and human beings. Veterans walked a little taller when passing the gates, and children's drawings appeared more frequently at the bases of guard posts. Other guards had received the new directive with mixed reactions. Some embraced the opportunity to connect with the public in meaningful ways. Others worried about maintaining the mystique and dignity that had always surrounded their role. All of them, however, recognized that something fundamental had changed in how they viewed their service. The transformation was just beginning. Thomas's simple acts of human recognition had created ripple effects that would eventually change not only how the Queen's Guard interacted with the public, but how the public perceived and appreciated their service. The balance between tradition and compassion was being rewritten, one small gesture at a time. The new directive had been in effect for 2 weeks when an unexpected situation tested its limits in ways no one could have anticipated. It was a gray October morning when Maria Santos arrived at Buckingham Palace with her 8-year-old son Carlos, who had been battling leukemia for the past year. The family had traveled from Spain specifically for this visit, which represented the fulfillment of a promise Maria had made to her son during his darkest days in the hospital. Carlos had always been fascinated by the stories his grandfather told about British soldiers during World War II. His grandfather, who had fought alongside British forces in North Africa, had filled the boy's imagination with tales of courage and honor. When Carlos began his cancer treatment, he found comfort in drawing pictures of brave soldiers, especially the famous red-coated guards he had seen in picture books. The chemotherapy had taken its toll on the young boy. His once thick black hair had fallen out completely, and his small frame looked even more fragile beneath his favorite jacket. But his eyes still sparkled with the same curiosity and determination that had carried him through months of difficult treatments. Corporal David Williams was on duty at the main gate when he noticed the Spanish family approaching. The boy walked slowly, clearly weak, but determined to reach the guard's position. His mother stayed close beside him, carrying a small backpack that seemed to hold something precious. As they drew closer, Williams could see that Carlos was wearing a small military-style cap that barely covered his bald head. Pinned to his jacket were several small medals and ribbons that his grandfather had given him, replicas of actual military decorations that the old soldier had earned decades earlier. The The boy's mother spoke to him quietly in Spanish, and Williams could see tears in her eyes as she translated something for her son. Carlos nodded seriously, then approached Williams' position with careful, measured steps that spoke of physical weakness but unshakable resolve. From his backpack, the boy withdrew a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a hand-painted wooden soldier, no more than 6 inches tall, dressed in the iconic red uniform of the Queen's Guard. Despite the obvious limitations of a child's artwork, the attention to detail was remarkable. Every button had been carefully painted, the colors were bright and cheerful, and the figure's face bore a kind expression that somehow captured both strength and gentleness. Carlos held up the wooden soldier, speaking in halting English that he had clearly practiced for weeks. "For you," he said simply. "My grandfather says soldiers help soldiers." Williams felt his throat tighten as he looked down at the frail child and his precious gift. The new directive allowed for acknowledgement of children's offerings, but this situation felt different, more significant than the guidelines had anticipated. Here was a sick child who had traveled across Europe to honor the guards, creating a gift that represented hours of careful work despite his illness. The boy's mother stepped forward and spoke in careful English. "He has been very sick, but he wanted to come here to thank the guards. In Spain, we remember how British soldiers helped us. Carlos made this for you because he says you protect people like the soldiers in his grandfather's stories." A small crowd had gathered, sensing the emotional weight of the moment. Unlike the usual tourist bustle, people stood quietly, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something important. Parents pulled their children closer, and several adults wiped away tears as they watched the scene unfold. Williams faced a decision that went beyond the scope of official directives. The wooden soldier was more than a child's drawing or simple gift. It was a work of art created by a seriously ill boy who had invested enormous physical and emotional energy into honoring the guards. Simply nodding acknowledgement seemed insufficient for such a sacrifice. Breaking from standard protocol, Williams carefully shifted his rifle to one hand and extended his other hand to accept the wooden soldier. The movement was slow and deliberate, maintaining the dignity of his position while clearly accepting the gift. As his gloved fingers closed around the small figure, Carlos's face transformed with joy so pure and complete that several onlookers began crying openly. The boy stepped back and, despite his weakness, attempted to stand at attention and salute. His small hand trembled as he held it to his forehead, but his posture was as straight and proud as his condition would allow. Williams, still holding the wooden soldier, returned the salute with full military precision, acknowledging not just the child, but the legacy of service that had inspired the gift. The moment lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but its impact rippled through the crowd like electricity. People began applauding spontaneously, not the casual applause of tourists watching a performance, but the deep, respectful clapping reserved for truly moving moments. Carlos turned to his mother, his face glowing with happiness, and spoke rapidly in Spanish about the guard who had accepted his gift and returned his salute. Williams carefully placed the wooden soldier in a secure pocket of his uniform, ensuring that Carlos could see his gift being treated with the respect it deserved. The boy's mother mouthed "thank you" in English, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude. As the Spanish family moved away, Carlos kept turning back to wave at Williams, who maintained his position, but allowed himself to meet the boy's gaze each time, reinforcing the connection they had established. Other tourists approached more respectfully after witnessing the interaction, and several veterans in the crowd stood a little taller, clearly moved by the display of mutual respect between young and old, sick and strong, foreign and British. Later that day, Williams learned from a palace staff member who spoke Spanish that the boy's mother had called the experience miraculous. Carlos had told everyone who would listen that a real British guard had accepted his soldier and saluted him back, making him feel like a true warrior in his own battle against illness. The wooden soldier remained in Williams' uniform pocket for the rest of his shift, a small weight that reminded him of the power of compassion to transform both giver and receiver. The moment had shown everyone present that true strength sometimes lies not in rigid adherence to rules, but in the wisdom to recognize when human connection transcends protocol. News of Corporal Williams's interaction with young Carlos spread even faster than Thomas Mitchell's earlier acts of compassion. A Spanish tourist had captured the entire exchange on video, and within hours, it had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. The footage showed the sick boy's determination, the guard's careful acceptance of the wooden soldier, and the emotional salute that had moved everyone present to tears. Major news networks picked up the story, broadcasting it across Europe and beyond. The Spanish embassy in London issued a statement praising the Queen's Guard's compassion and respect for a young Spanish citizen's tribute to British military tradition. Veterans organizations in multiple countries shared the video, citing it as an example of how military service creates bonds that transcend nationality, age, and circumstance. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the incident, Colonel Hartwell received a phone call from Buckingham Palace's private secretary, informing him that the Queen herself had seen the video and requested a private audience with both Corporal Williams and the young Spanish boy if his health permitted travel back to London. The announcement sent shockwaves through the Guard regiment. In living memory, no common soldier had been granted a private audience for showing compassion to a member of the public. Royal protocols typically reserved such honors for acts of exceptional military service or sacrifice. That a simple gesture of kindness toward a sick child had warranted the Queen's personal attention spoke volumes about the changing nature of what constituted honorable service. Carlos' mother, Maria, initially worried that the return journey might be too taxing for her son, whose treatment schedule was demanding and unpredictable. However, when Carlos learned about the invitation, his doctors noted an immediate improvement in his spirits and energy levels. They agreed that the emotional boost might actually aid his recovery, and arrangements were made for the family to return to London. The private audience was scheduled for a quiet Tuesday morning in one of the palace's smaller reception rooms. Corporal Williams, dressed in his dress uniform rather than the ceremonial red coat, arrived early with Colonel Hartwell. Both men felt the weight of the unprecedented situation, understanding that they were participating in something that would likely be remembered and discussed for years to come. When Carlos and his mother arrived, the transformation in the boy was remarkable. Though still obviously undergoing treatment, he carried himself with new confidence and purpose. He wore his best clothes along with his grandfather's replica medals, and clutched a small wrapped package that clearly contained another gift. The Queen entered the room with characteristic grace and immediately put everyone at ease with her warm demeanor. She spoke first to Carlos in careful, simple English, asking about his journey and his health. When the boy responded in his practiced English mixed with enthusiastic Spanish, she smiled and continued the conversation with patience and genuine interest. "I understand you made something very special for our guard," she said, gesturing toward Williams. Carlos nodded eagerly and began explaining about the wooden soldier, his grandfather's stories, and why he had wanted to honor the British Guards. The Queen listened intently, asking questions that demonstrated she had clearly been briefed about Carlos's situation and background. When she learned about his grandfather's service alongside British forces, she spoke knowledgeably about that campaign and expressed gratitude for the international cooperation that had helped secure victory. Then she turned to Corporal Williams. "And you chose to accept this young man's gift, despite it being somewhat outside normal protocol." Her tone was curious rather than critical, inviting explanation rather than demanding justification. Williams straightened slightly, but maintained a respectful posture as he responded, "Your Majesty, it seemed that refusing such a heartfelt tribute would have been a greater violation of our duty to serve with honor than accepting it." The young man had put tremendous effort and meaning into his gift. The Queen nodded thoughtfully. "Show me this wooden soldier," she requested. Williams carefully withdrew the figure from his uniform pocket, where it had remained since the day Carlos gave it to him. The Queen examined it closely, commenting on the careful attention to detail and the obvious love that had gone into its creation. "Carlos," she said, turning back to the boy, "this is beautiful work. Your grandfather would be very proud of how you've honored the tradition of soldiers helping soldiers." Carlos beamed at the praise, and his mother wiped away tears of joy. From his package, Carlos produced another wooden figure, this one slightly larger and painted with even more care. It depicted the Queen herself in a simple but recognizable representation, complete with a tiny crown and kind expression. "For you," he said, offering the figure with the same ceremony he had shown Williams. The Queen accepted the gift with genuine pleasure, examining every detail and praising Carlos's artistic skill. She then did something completely unprecedented. She asked Carlos if he would like to see the wooden soldier displayed in a place of honor. When the boy nodded excitedly, she led the small group to a nearby display case containing various gifts from children around the Commonwealth. Carefully placing both wooden figures in prominent positions within the case, the Queen explained that these gifts from young people often meant more to her than formal state presents because they represented pure affection and respect rather than diplomatic obligation. Before the audience concluded, the Queen had one final surprise. She presented Carlos with a small medal designed specifically for young people who showed exceptional courage in facing illness. It was not an official state decoration, but rather a personal token of recognition that she occasionally awarded to children who inspired her with their bravery. As the family prepared to leave, the Queen spoke privately with Williams, thanking him for demonstrating that true military service includes compassion alongside discipline. She mentioned that his actions had reminded her of the human purpose behind all ceremonial duty, and expressed hope that other guards would follow his example when appropriate situations arose. The audience lasted only 45 minutes, but its impact would last much longer. Carlos returned to Spain with renewed energy for his treatment, carrying the memory of a queen who had treated him as an honored guest rather than a sick child. Williams returned to his duties with the knowledge that compassion and protocol need not be opposing forces. Most importantly, the Queen's public approval of compassionate service sent a clear message throughout the military and beyond. True honor sometimes requires the courage to put human dignity above rigid rules, and the wisdom to recognize when such moments arise. 6 months after the Queen's unprecedented audience, the culture of the Queen's Guard had undergone a quiet but profound transformation. What had begun with Thomas Mitchell's subtle nod to a World War II veteran had evolved into a new understanding of what it meant to serve with both honor and humanity. The wooden soldiers created by young Carlos had become symbols of this change, prominently displayed in the Queen's personal collection, and frequently mentioned in official communications about the Guard's role in modern Britain. The Spanish boy himself had made remarkable progress in his cancer treatment, with his doctors attributing part of his improvement to the psychological boost he had received from his royal recognition. Colonel Hartwell had formalized the new approach through what became known as the Compassionate Service Guidelines, which provided clear parameters for when guards could appropriately acknowledge members of the public. These guidelines were carefully crafted to maintain military discipline while allowing for meaningful human connection in deserving circumstances. The guidelines specified that guards could offer subtle acknowledgement to veterans displaying military decorations, children presenting respectful gifts or artwork, and individuals clearly in need of recognition for acts of service or courage. All interactions had to remain brief, dignified, and consistent with the solemnity of royal ceremonial duties. Thomas Mitchell found himself promoted to sergeant major and tasked with training new guards in the balance between tradition and compassion. His training sessions became legendary among recruits, who learned not only the technical aspects of ceremonial duty, but also the wisdom needed to recognize when human connection served a higher purpose than rigid protocol. "Remember," he would tell new guards during their orientation, "we stand here not just to look impressive for tourists, but to embody the values that make Britain worth protecting. Sometimes those values require us to acknowledge the dignity of those who approach us with genuine respect." The changes attracted international attention, with military units from other countries studying how the Queen's Guard had successfully evolved their protocols without compromising their essential dignity. Delegations from various Commonwealth nations visited to observe the new approach, and several implemented similar guidelines for their own ceremonial units. Tourist experiences at Buckingham Palace became richer and more meaningful. Families planned visits more thoughtfully, often researching appropriate ways to show respect to the guards. Children's artwork improved dramatically as young artists understood their creations might actually be acknowledged. Veterans from around the world made pilgrimages to the palace knowing their service might be recognized by fellow servicemen. The monthly ceremony that Colonel Hartwell had established grew into a significant event, attended by families whose interactions with guards had created lasting memories. Each ceremony featured stories of meaningful connections. Elderly veterans who had received acknowledgement after decades of feeling forgotten, children whose confidence had been boosted by respectful recognition, and families who had found hope during difficult times through small acts of military compassion. Carlos and his mother returned to London for the 6-month anniversary ceremony, where the boy was invited to present the newest version of the Compassionate Service Guidelines to Colonel Hartwell. His English had improved dramatically, and his health continued to progress positively. During his presentation, he spoke about how the guards had shown him that strength and kindness were not opposing qualities but complementary virtues. "The soldiers taught me that being brave doesn't mean being cold," Carlos said in his careful English. "It means being strong enough to care about others even when you have important jobs to do." The ceremony also honored Thomas Mitchell and David Williams, whose initial acts of compassion had sparked the transformation. Both men spoke about the unexpected consequences of their decisions to prioritize human dignity over rigid rule following, and how those moments had taught them new dimensions of military service. Perhaps most significantly, the changes had improved the guards' own sense of purpose and job satisfaction. Many reported that the ability to occasionally connect with the public in meaningful ways made their long hours of motionless duty feel more valuable and personally rewarding. They understood their role not just as ceremonial figures but as representatives of military values that included both strength and compassion. The transformation extended beyond the guards themselves to the entire support structure around them. Palace staff began facilitating more meaningful interactions between guards and special visitors. Tour guides educated visitors about appropriate ways to show respect. Even street performers and vendors in the area adopted more respectful approaches, understanding that they were part of a larger environment that now explicitly valued dignity and human connection. As the first year of the new guidelines concluded, Colonel Hartwell compiled a comprehensive report on their impact. The statistics were impressive. Visitor satisfaction had increased significantly, complaints about guard behavior had virtually disappeared, and recruitment for the Queen's Guard had seen a notable uptick as young soldiers were attracted to service that valued both tradition and humanity. But beyond the numbers, the real success was evident in countless small moments throughout each day. Veterans stood a little taller when passing the guards. Children approached with artwork created with genuine care and respect. Families from around the world left the palace with stories of meaningful connection rather than simple tourist snapshots. The Queen herself had commented privately that the changes represented the best of British military tradition, the wisdom to evolve and adapt while maintaining essential values. The wooden soldiers in her display case served as daily reminders that true strength often reveals itself through gentleness, and that the most important rules are sometimes the ones we have the courage to thoughtfully break. The transformation that began with one guard's decision to acknowledge one veteran's dignity had created ripple effects that would influence military service, public interaction, and the definition of honor for years to come. It proved that compassion above rules, when applied with wisdom and respect, could strengthen rather than weaken the very traditions it seemed to challenge.